Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending upon where you're watching from. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you to our Israel in Crisis Briefing Program number 4, a special series of America at a Crossroads during these really tough times of the war between Israel and Hamas. On behalf of our leadership team, Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, Rabbi Ken Chazen, and Caroline Kelly, I welcome tonight's special guest, Ambassador Dennis Ross, who has been extremely generous with his time for our benefit, and we are beyond appreciative. Also welcome to the always brilliant and generous Patt Morrison. Our next Israel in Crisis briefing will be on December 3rd from 10 to 11 in the morning with American-born Israeli journalist and thought leader Yossi Klein Halevi in conversation with Rabbi Ed Feinstein. Our next regular program is on November 29th. While Martin Barron, the former executive editor of the Washington Post, informed us of a non-resolvable conflict he had for next week, we are very fortunate that one of the media world's most prodigious opinion columnists, Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post, has agreed to join us on November 29th. That's a week from this Wednesday. She will be in conversation with Patt Morrison. There is no program this Wednesday in observance of the Thanksgiving holiday. And while I expressed my Thanksgiving sentiments to you last week, I remain grateful to my partners in this America at a Crossroads enterprise, and grateful to our moderators and guests, and above all, grateful to our loyal audience, without whom this series would not exist or persist. And in David Lair's memory, I will do my very best to remain optimistic about current events. I wish every single member of this audience a happy Thanksgiving. And about those conversations which might arise around your Thanksgiving tables with relatives or friends who might have a different perspective or a perspective that is at odds with your own, we hope that last week's program with David Brooks has left you with some really good ideas about managing those conversations. If you need a refresher, that program is on our website at our past events link, chooseunitedfordemocracy.org. Now, I would like to welcome former Congressman Mel Levine, a key colleague in our America at a Crossroads leadership team, to introduce tonight's guests. Mel?
Thanks very much, Janice. It's a real privilege to be able to introduce Ambassador Dennis Ross, who's been very generous with his time, particularly during this extremely difficult set of circumstances. Few people have the knowledge and experience regarding the Middle East as Dennis Ross. Dennis was a central Middle East strategist in the administrations of Bush Sr., as well as the Clinton administration and the Obama administration. I suspect that no one has committed more time and energy to achieving peace in the Middle East as Dennis Ross. I actually spent quite a bit of time with him on those efforts during the Clinton administration, and we're very, very grateful and appreciative that Dennis has once again made himself available to speak with our group. Dennis will be interviewed by the wonderful Patt Morrison, who is a multi-award-winning journalist, a superb writer for the LA Times, and fortunately for us, a frequent moderator for our programs. Patt?
Congressman, thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us too. We all want to keep us up to date and as close to events as possible, to track them, to understand them, and to see how they affect our lives domestically and foreign, and our own, as you just heard, relationships perhaps within our circle of friends and family. Ambassador Ross, thank you for coming back and joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
For several days now, we've been hearing about a hostage deal in the works. Where does that stand? How does it come about? Who was involved? What's the quid pro quo?
So there has been a set of discussions that have been largely moderated by the Qataris, who have a relationship with the Hamas political leadership. Khaled Mashal, former leader of Hamas politically, Ismail Haniyeh, the current leader of Hamas politically, are in Qatar. There are other leading members of Hamas, like Abu Marzouk, who also reside in Qatar. One of the issues, Qatar has clearly maintained a relationship with Hamas. They've provided money to Hamas. In theory, that gives them a degree of leverage with Hamas. It certainly gives them plenty of access to Hamas. The US, the Biden administration, has been working along with the Egyptians and with the Israelis, with the Qataris, who are, between the Qataris and the Egyptians, there obviously is a there are discussion channels with Hamas. They're not so simple for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is Yahya Sinwar, who was the architect of the October 7th onslaught, who is the real leader of Hamas in Gaza, who comes from the Izzuddin al-Qassam brigades, who was a prisoner in Israeli jails for 23 years, who is fluent in Hebrew. He is the one who is calling the shots within Gaza. He is deep underground, as you might imagine. There have been periods of time when it has not been so easy to communicate with him for reasons that are fairly obvious, I think, given the nature of the current war. That helps to explain why some of this seems on and off. For some time, what was on offer from Sinwar and company was 50 hostages being released. 50, that number has been fairly consistent. Other numbers were out there, but the 50 has been fairly consistent, to be comprised primarily of women and children, to include some of the foreign hostages, including there are 9 or 10 Americans, in return for a 5-day pause in the Israeli military campaign, including everything, meaning they stop all military efforts on the ground, they stop all bombing for 5 days. And over 5 days, groups of hostages amounting to about 50 will be released. So there's a 5-day pause, and there are a number of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, and some who are teenagers, I would say anywhere from 16 to, could be 15 to 19 who are in Israeli jails. Some number of them would be released as well. Now, this is, if you don't mind, I'll explain a little bit more about, there's been a debate on the Israeli side as to whether or not to close such a deal. There are those on the Israeli side, primarily in Shin Bet, some of the political leadership, probably the defense minister as well, who believe the fact that Hamas wants to set 5-day pause is an indication that they are really under pressure, and this is not the time to relieve the pressure. And so they're not keen on a 5-day pause. They're not keen on agreeing to this now. The leadership, interestingly enough, the leadership of the IDF, the chief of staff of the IDF, the former minister of defense, Benny Gantz, who's in the war cabinet. The war cabinet is Prime Minister Netanyahu, the defense minister Gallant, Benny Gantz, Gadi Eisenkot, and Ron Dermer. That's the war cabinet. Eisenkot, former chief of staff of the military, Gantz, former chief of staff, and former minister of defense, are both very strongly in favor of doing the deal, as is most of the IDF leadership. And the reason most of the IDF leadership is in favor of it is they feel they failed. The Israelis who were taken hostage, their responsibility was to defend them, to protect them, to prevent this. And their view is, if there's an opening to get them back, our responsibility is to get them back. We can resume after 5 days. We can still succeed in the military campaign. But if there's an opportunity to get them back, we need to get these 50, because we don't know. If the window closes and we can't get them back, this is a loss that is ultimately not defensible. Again, let's bear in mind is to get single individuals back or even dead bodies back. So that's the attitude, and I believe that sentiment is going to prevail upon, and Prime Minister Netanyahu will do the deal. He has to full agreement of the whole cabinet. Any prisoner release requires full agreement of the whole cabinet.
We're getting a little break in your connection, Ambassador, so we may have to reconnect down the road, but for now we seem to be okay. What's the sentiment in Israel among the people about a hostage deal?
There was a very big demonstration over the weekend in favor of the hostage, getting any deal you can, but clearly preference is releasing all the hostages. One of the reasons that there's been a sentiment within Israel not to provide humanitarian assistance is, they don't feel many people feel humanitarian assistance shouldn't be provided so long as hostages are being held. The problem with that, it might be understandable emotionally, the problem with it is the people who you'd be harming have no influence over whether or not hostages get released. The people who, who in a sense hold the hostages have the less humanitarian assistance Israel provides, the better. They want more Palestinians to suffer. They want more Palestinians to die. The worse it gets from their standpoint, the better it is in terms of changing the balance of opinion internationally. And their view is they want a ceasefire, not a pause. They want a ceasefire. They want Israel to stop. They want to create the pressures on Israel to stop. So the worse it gets from their standpoint, the better it is. They have never been concerned about the well-being of the Palestinian public. They use them not only as human shields, they basically hold them hostage.
Wouldn't a pause have the same effect as a ceasefire in allowing Hamas perhaps to regroup?
It will give them time to regroup somewhat. They really won't be in a position to rearm because they won't be able in that 5-day period to get arms coming in from the outside. At this point, one of the reasons Israel has been focused primarily in the northern part of Gaza. The vast majority of the military infrastructure, which includes, by the way, a military industrial base which Hamas has developed. Most of what they fired, whether it's drones or rockets or mortars, are now made within Gaza. Originally, they got most of their assistance from the Iranians and from the Hezbollah. Hezbollah helped them develop their military industrial base. Israel, most of that is in the northern part of Gaza. Most of that is now being destroyed by the Israelis. So a pause, it may allow them to regroup. It may allow them to move around in different places in the tunnel system, this vast warren of tunnels underground, but it won't really allow them, in a sense, to be able to rearm.
I want to talk a little later about both the domestic impact of this in the United States and, of course, in Israel. But as you know, a lot of the public opinion on this is being driven by the video that we're seeing. We have video from the IDF about, look, here are the tunnels under the hospital. Here's what we were telling you about Hamas using these tunnels. And that's been received in one fashion. And then there are the videos of newborn premature infants having to be ferried into Egypt, people in hospitals suffering and dying. So we have those parallel videos, and those very much govern how people perceive what's going on. This is another level of the discussion or even of warfare, if you want to talk about that. Is that battle for public opinion? Where is that going?
I think internationally it has shifted against the Israelis, in part because one thing the Israelis have not done is release the videos that the Hamas fighters basically had these, they had these cameras on them, and they were taking videos because they were celebrating the torture and the killing of the people that they were abusing. The Israelis have not released those videos because they feel they're too graphic, and they worry about the effect on the members of the families of those Israelis who were brutalized. I think that actually would have an effect if those videos were released. They've shown them to journalists, but they haven't released them to the networks. I still think they should, given what's going on. Look, it's hard, having been in Saudi Arabia, it's very hard if you're sitting in the Arab world and you look at these videos of what's happening in Gaza on the ground to Palestinians, to women, to children, the pictures you're describing of the infants in the incubators, which the Israelis allowed to go to Egypt. I mean, the fact is, it's pretty hard not to be affected emotionally by what you see. And I think generally there's a tendency right now, in terms of the broader opinion internationally, I think it's shifted more in favor of a ceasefire, just for reasons that understand, just stop the killing. And of course, the problem is a ceasefire at this stage, basically before Hamas has really been, I think, defeated to the point where it loses its military wherewithal, where it loses its command control, where its organizational coherence has been lost, where it's so weakened it can no longer control Gaza. If we don't end up with that outcome, Hamas will make a comeback, and Hamas will do this again, and they will rebuild just as they have before.
Well, then how damaged is Hamas? Because I'm thinking of 9/11, and when the United States went after al-Qaeda, it was targeting principally personnel. There was no al-Qaeda infrastructure per se. It was a mobile, personality-driven organization. When you took out the personalities, you had a devastating effect on the organization. Is that not the case here, where the infrastructure seems to be as much the principal target as any of the leadership?
There is a much more developed infrastructure, which also includes the tunnels. There's about 300 miles of tunnels that Hamas has developed. Again, tunnels that are not used by, if the tunnels had been available for the Palestinian public, we would see far fewer Palestinian deaths, but they're not. It's for the leaders, it's for the fighters, it's for their weapons. And those tunnels are part of that infrastructure. The Israelis have uncovered more than 500 shafts of the tunnels. They're proceeding apace to sort of destroy many of the tunnels. They do it, they have to be careful about it, because they also understand this is most likely where the hostages are being kept. So they are careful in terms of how they proceed. They're careful because many of these are booby-trapped. They're using robots and other devices to sort of check in the tunnels. So there's the tunnels on the one hand. There's the military industrial base that I was describing on the other. Those, I think, they have very heavily destroyed at this point. In addition to that, there are all sorts of military command posts. They have taken over in the northern part of Gaza. They've taken over most of those. There are now large numbers of Hamas that are actually surrendering to them, which itself is interesting, because Hamas tries to inculcate a martyrdom complex. So the fact that many in the north, at least, are surrendering to them, it says something about the state of morale at this point among the Hamas fighters, and it also says something at this point about the effectiveness of some of the Israeli tactics. Now, having said that, there are 24 battalions overall of Hamas in all of Gaza. The Israelis at this point, there are about 14 of those that are in the northern part of Gaza. At this point, the Israelis have probably destroyed about 12 of the 14 battalions. So it's not just the individuals, it's the whole structure of them as an organization. It's the infrastructure I was describing, the caches of weapons. The numbers of rockets being fired from Gaza now is down to about 10% of what it was. And most of those are probably coming from the south now. That again says the launch points, those who are launching the rockets, the caches of rockets that were available, a lot of those have now been destroyed, and that accounts for the fact that the numbers of launches into Israel are dramatically down, because they're just basically it's a combination of running out, and there aren't a lot of safe places for them to be launching from at this point.
As far as how the war against Hamas is being waged, there's a dispute whether this is overkill, in the sense of it doesn't seem to be pinpoint, it doesn't seem to be targeted to necessarily to individuals, apart from the geography of the Hamas locations, where that Israel would have the capacity to do that, to be more selective and use a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer. The question of proportionality comes up in the rule of war. Can you address how those are being handled? Is this a decision being made from the very top in the cabinet?
I think there's a number of, I think it's a very good question. I think there's a number of issues that are related here. First, there is such a thing as proportionality in the law of humanitarian warfare. It does not say you cannot attack military targets. It says you can attack military targets, but you need to try to minimize the civilian consequences of attacking the military targets. Now, Hamas obviously embeds in the most dense populated areas. Some of what the Israelis uncovered this weekend was a very huge cache of arms in a kindergarten, in an elementary school. So a lot of the command posts, it's not just the hospital, the Al-Shifa hospital. It's all the hospitals. Rantisi, they were showing that's not only where hushes were kept, but also, again, significant caches of arms were there. So they embed in places that they hope that either this will deter the Israelis from attacking those targets, or if they do, the Israelis pay this public price if they do. It's a very complicated, obviously, set of calculations for the Israelis. One of the considerations, I think, after October 7th was a change in the Israeli calculus, at least at the beginning of the war. I'm not so sure it's true now, but at least at the beginning of this operation, the Israelis have always created a hierarchy of the most important military targets. they always had connected to that as well, what were the likely civilian casualties if you hit these targets? In the past, there would be frequently decisions made where they would rule out hitting certain targets because the civilian consequences were just too high. After October 7th, when the objective was, we have to basically destroy the command control, we have to destroy the most important positions they have if we're going to succeed militarily, that balance shifted in terms of how they made the decisions. So at least the early decisions of what they were hitting were less constrained than they've been in the past. And I would say that was heavily influenced by not just the consequences of October 7th, but also the consideration, if we don't hit these targets, we cannot succeed militarily in the objective that we've set for ourselves. And that objective is weakening Hamas to the point where they no longer control Gaza. That balance, I think, changed because of what was at stake. I think we are seeing now less of those targets being hit, partly because you're in a ground campaign. And by definition, once the ground campaign started, you were more selective in terms of what you were hitting from the air, although they're still doing it. I will say, there is a level of precision now precisely because of their own forces. There were rules they also applied in the past in terms of supporting ground forces, that there had to be a certain distance away from where the ground forces were to still drop on those targets. They have reduced the distance that they're required to follow if their ground forces are there. But again, they're using more precision kinds of weapons to ensure even if they're closer to their own forces, they can still hit the target. So there is almost by definition, the bombing is different than it was for the first couple of weeks before you had significant ground forces in Gaza.
And yet we see Palestinians who are told, go to the south, go to safe places, and then
Yeah.
there are attacks on places in the south. So there's a sense that the options that are being preferred to the people in Gaza are getting fewer and fewer, and the danger is getting greater and greater for the civilians.
Right. Look, there are part of what we're finding in some cases, it's hard to know. You get different reports from different sides. And so if you ask the Israelis right now, they will say they're not bombing the areas where they're asking people to move. And there are tent cities that have been made up, and they have allowed corridors where they don't bomb at all for like 4 hours or so for people to move. I think both in the case of Al-Shifa Hospital and in terms of people who moved to the south in these corridors, I think that you probably had Hamas officials dress up as civilians and basically lose themselves in these crowds, but coming out of Al-Shifa Hospital and certainly going to the south. I think, the Israelis have set for themselves targets of the Hamas leadership. And they have killed, they've killed 10. There's a Shura council that leads them that has 20 people. The Israelis are saying that they have killed 10 of those 20. They've killed many of the local commanders, but I still think, look, we shouldn't kid ourselves. There are still plenty of Hamas out there. And the question of infrastructure versus individuals, I think the distinction is one I'm trying to draw, because I think that's more important. Anybody who thinks there's never been a case where Israel is going to annihilate Hamas. First, it's an organization that exists outside of Gaza. Secondly, there are a lot of people who identify as Hamas who may be part of the bureaucratic structure there, but they still follow a leadership, or they're basically, they take their cues from the leadership. There are individuals who may be armed. You're not going to get all of them, but if you undermine the organizational coherence and basically most of the political leadership is gone, and fighters no longer have their commanders, then you really change the whole equation. That's what I think what the Israelis are trying to do.
You made a point last time you and I spoke, and there were a couple of follow-up questions we didn't get to, and that was the question of why Palestinians are not welcomed in other parts of the Middle East. And one would think that this is the natural moment for them to be embraced as they flee this conflict. Why is that the case?
Yeah, I understand the source of the question, especially if you paid attention to Ukraine, where 15% of the population became refugees and moved to the surrounding areas. We also have some who've come to our country. And so it's natural for people to ask that. And some of it relates to the character of this conflict. The image of displacement for Palestinians goes back to 1948, and what they call the Nakba, literally what it means is catastrophe. And the idea that they would be displaced again is, again, part of a narrative that this is how they would say, and some of the Arab states would say, the Israelis want to solve the conflict. We're not going to let the Israelis think that they can solve the conflict by just placing Palestinians. So Egypt is not willing to go along with it, again, because of this broader story. The same with Jordan. Other Arab states, the same. You could say maybe it shouldn't be that way, but that's the reality that has emerged. And I've been pushing an alternative idea so far without success. And that is, okay, I understand no displacement to the Arab states right now. What about the injured being treated in the West Bank? What about some of the displaced going to the West Bank? This is not having Palestinians leave what are Palestinian areas. This is still consistent. If you want a Palestinian state at some point, you're having Palestinians move to part of what would be a Palestinian state. This is fundamentally different than the kind of displacement to Arab states. Why not allow that as a possibility? So far, that idea has not been embraced yet, but I'm still pushing it.
There's a question from Julie. I think we've spoken to it before, but internally in Gaza, the resistance that Palestinians themselves have, the resentment of Hamas for putting them in this position versus the sympathy that they may have for Hamas. And of course, we know there haven't been elections there in any number of years. So before and after, I'm sure the opinion changed before and after the war, before and after the Israeli bombings. But generally, what's going on among Palestinians whose attitude toward Hamas may be not exactly supportive, but what choices do they have?
Well, the short answer is they don't really have any choices. And Hamas, doesn't brook dissent. There was opinion polls before October 7th that showed 62% of Palestinians in Gaza did not want Hamas to break what was an ongoing ceasefire. There's some opinion polls I've just seen that show very different numbers now, so sort of supporting Hamas, which doesn't surprise me in the current setting. The anger level towards Israel is high, as you might imagine, but I also recall in 2014, when you had a conflict that went on for 52 days, 12,600 buildings were totally destroyed, 6,500 were severely damaged, and 150 total were not inhabitable. And when Palestinians, basically at the end of this, when Palestinians came out, they were very angry at Hamas for having created this. I think the mood right now, while the bombing goes on, while the Israelis are still carrying out the military campaign, I would say I would not be surprised if the mood was sort of supportive, but certainly hostile towards the Israelis. And I'm not saying at the end of this there's going to be this kind of change in attitude towards Israel for the better. I think there'll be a change in attitude, but it'll be a grimmer and more angry one. But I think people are kidding themselves as they think at the end of this, when Palestinians see the results of what's happened, that they will look to Hamas and think, gee, really glad that they helped to bring this about. I think the key, however, will be how soon can you create an alternative interim administration to govern Gaza? How quickly can reconstruction begin to take place so that Palestinians who are living in Gaza see that life suddenly gets better when Hamas is not in control? A lot of this depends upon what is done in what I call day after, or the days after. I like to say, you don't plan for the day after on the day after. The planning for that needs to be happening now, focusing on who can play the reconstruction role, both in terms of financing it, but also managing a mechanism to ensure that the materials that will come in are actually used for the intended purposes and don't get diverted. All that needs to be done now. I do think the administration is beginning to prepare that. I don't know how much they're talking to others about it. I think they're beginning to prepare it increasingly, but that is critical. Look, the worst thing, this is a catastrophe. There's no other way to describe it. maybe it's not the equivalent of what's happened in Syria, where there's 600,000 dead and most of the country, so much of the country was destroyed. But it's a catastrophe. It's a human catastrophe for the Palestinians there. The level of destruction is extremely, it's extensive. It's been a catastrophe for Israelis as well. There are, people forget, there's 150,000 Israelis who have been evacuated from their homes and haven't been able to go back to them. So this is a catastrophic situation. And the last thing you want to do is in the aftermath of a catastrophe is not to change behavior. I mean, something needs to be done in the aftermath of this. First, so Hamas is still not in control. But then second, to begin to reconstruct Gaza, to revitalize the Palestinian Authority, and to come up with what will also be some kind of political horizon for dealing with the Israelis and the Palestinians, so that we don't stay, so we're not in what I call the October 6th reality, which was no sense of possibility, no hope, no sense of change, which has been a condition. Anybody who thinks that if you maintain that condition, even if you've defeated Hamas, you're not going to produce other radicals on the Palestinian side, they're kidding themselves.
We'll talk a little more about the end game because we have a lot of questions coming in about the mechanics of that. But I'd like to talk about domestic politics in the U.S. and in Israel. And we see, I don't know, maybe not since Vietnam, or at least the anti-apartheid protests of the 80s, the kind of dissension and dissent on campuses. There are investigations into anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim expressions on college campuses in this country. The State Teacher Federation in Minneapolis posted a resolution on Facebook condemning American support for Israel. That's generated its own controversy. You have Democratic elected officials like Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon saying we need a ceasefire, we need to limit civilian casualties. And the Biden administration is trying to be Solomonic and make sure that both sides, both issues are dealt with. For example, yes, committed still to a two-state solution, but not willing to call yet for a ceasefire. This is really having some major repercussions on the home front and may play out in the next election.
For sure. Look, it's we see, certainly on the Democratic Party side, and I've spent some time briefing on both the Senate and the House side. There are those who are increasingly looking at what's going on and saying, well, what's wrong with a ceasefire? Look at a ceasefire, we can stop the killing, we can stop the suffering. And the problem, of course, with it is if Hamas is still able to recoup and is still in control, you're basically saying this will happen again, number one. You're also saying that their strategy of embedding themselves in a civilian population has been validated. You're basically saying any country that faces this kind of a threat, they are not permitted to go after those who create a strategy of using human shields. And if we continue to validate that, we're going to continue to see it as a strategy by groups like not just Hamas, but Hezbollah and others. So it's painful to say. And what it requires is the Israelis have to do a better job on the humanitarian side of things. It's not just what we were talking about before, how they target. It's also they have to do a better job in terms of allowing humanitarian assistance to go in. The problem is they're not preventing it now. The problem is that you have a bottleneck in Rafah. Rafah is the only crossing. Rafah does not have the most modern scanning techniques. Every truck has to be individually inspected. Now that limits the number of trucks that can get into Gaza per day. If you use Kerem Shalom, which is the crossing point on the Israeli side, it's an Israeli crossing point, it has all the most modern scanning techniques. The numbers of trucks going in could be quadrupled. And that would go a very long way towards addressing what are the ability to get humanitarian assistance to the people who need it. It's going to become more pronounced in the South because all these people are down there. You're facing a change in the weather. You need to get more tents in there. You need to get all sorts of different support in there as well. And only if Kerem Shalom is open are you likely to be able to get that number of trucks in. Now, the Israelis aren't doing it because there's a security consideration. I understand there's a security consideration. I understand that there's a risk with this, but there's also a risk to their strategic objective. Their strategic objective, really a strategic imperative, is to ensure that Hamas is defeated in a way that it's too weak to prevent anybody else from coming in and administering Gaza. So here you have a balance of priorities, and the tactical need on security is understandable, but it's not as important as a strategic imperative succeeding. For the US and for the Biden administration to continue to create the time and space for Israel to achieve that strategic imperative, they need to show that the humanitarian needs are being addressed. So I would like to see more of an effort made. I know the administration is trying. I'd like to see more of an effort made on that. I know it's not so simple in Israel because, again, this is an Israeli crossing in. It would not be a popular thing given the public mood in Israel, given what's happened. But again, you have to weigh what your choices are. In any situation when you have very hard choices, what's called on for leadership is make those choices.
How much leverage then does the U.S. have that it can exert behind the scenes on Netanyahu without risking an appearance of ending or fracturing its support for Israel?
Look, I don't think it's obviously not unlimited, but let's remember that President Biden has done what nobody else has done. And I mean, he's the first American president, the only American president ever to go to Israel during wartime. He has built political capital with the Israeli public. If you had an election in Israel today, I can tell you Biden would win as prime minister, not Netanyahu. I mean, Biden has real credit with the Israeli public. And the result of that is it gives him the ability to ask for things that will be difficult. So, you know, I'm not saying he has unlimited influence on this because, again, Israel suffered a trauma, and this is a country still experiencing the effects of that trauma. And, you know, the choices have to be made. Well, you know, while their military campaign to this point has been much more successful than people within the administration thought, the number of Israeli military casualties are much lower than they thought. I mean, dramatically lower than they thought would be the case to this point. But they're not low as Israel measures them. We're talking about 60 IDF that have been killed so far. Maybe not the hundreds that were foreseen by people here, but still, from an Israeli standpoint, not insignificant. So, you know, everything they do, they're going to weigh in terms of the losses they themselves are going to suffer.
Now, as far as internal politics, domestic politics in Israel, there was a recent poll, 80% of Israelis polled said Netanyahu has to take responsibility for the security failures, and even fewer said they can trust what he says about what's going on. And as you said, Joe Biden or who knows who else would beat him handily if an election were held today. So he's really fighting two fronts. He's got a war to wage, and he's got a fight for his own political survival, both concurrently and hereafter.
The polls that I find most compelling, and they seem on the surface paradoxical, but they're really not. There is enormous trust in the Israeli military, which is a little bit surprising after October 7th, because they were caught so unprepared. But nonetheless, this is a citizen army, so it's not that surprising. But what is surprising is there's enormous trust in the Israeli military and almost no trust in the current Israeli government. Unprecedented in wartime to see that. Secondly, not a surprise, the Israeli public, when it comes to what they require for security, has moved to the right. But at the same time, they say they want a government in the center. They don't want a right-wing religious government, meaning what they have now. So and this is very consistent in terms of what the polling is, and it's reflected in what you said. It's actually 77% of the Israeli public in one poll hold Netanyahu responsible for what happened. And so when you look at all these, I've said to you before, there will be a political reckoning in Israel. It's only a matter of time, but it's also I will say one thing I'm surprised by. I'm surprised there are a number of voices in Israel pressing for a change now. It's not a majority. It doesn't reflect a consensus. But I thought you really wouldn't see a lot of prominent voices for that until after the military campaign was over. You do have the leader of the currently largest opposition party, not the largest in the polling now, but the largest existing opposition party, Yair Lapid, has called for Netanyahu to resign and still to have a Likud-led government that they would join. You know, I'm a little surprised at seeing that, just because I thought you wouldn't see much of an impulse to be playing politics at this point. We'll see how it plays out, but there will be a political reckoning. This was the darkest day in Israel's history. It was from the standpoint, people tend to forget, Israel had never had any of their territory. They were talking Israel pre-67. In any war since 48, none of its territory had ever been seized, even for any length of time. Zero, ever. Not 56, not 67, not 73, not 82 with Lebanon. Even in these asymmetrical wars with Hezbollah and Hamas, 2006, and then the 2009, 12, 14, 21, in none of these other cases was any of what I call pre-67 Israel, was any of it ever taken for any length of period of time. So this is a trauma for all sorts of reasons, not just the numbers of people, not just the brutality and the atrocities, but the mere fact that Israel had its territory occupied for a short period of time. All of this, was a complete shock. And that it could happen this way, it's not the intelligence leadership, which is a very, very talented group of people I know very well, but they operate on an assumption. The assumption proved to be wrong with tragic consequences. This is an impressive group of people. I have no doubt about that they will resign. They won't be asked to leave. When this is over, they'll resign. I think you're going to see some resignations in the military. Same thing, not being asked to resign. It will create pressures on the political side because of that.
We have a number of questions from our audience. Thank you all, and you can put them in the Q&A box. So we may hop around a little, Ambassador. Barbara wants you to speak to the role of the other countries in the region who might have an interest in destroying Hamas and also moving the parties to a more permanent solution.
It is an interesting way of putting it. What I've found in my conversations with Arab officials is nobody wants Hamas to survive, but nobody wants the price that the Palestinians are paying to go on. So among the Arabs, there is a tendency at this point to demand a ceasefire. They feel pressure from their publics, and part of it is you can't be watching any of the Arab satellite television networks and not see the constant images of what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza. So it's creating a groundswell of emotions, and you have different Arab leaderships that are quite sensitive to that, and they're even worried about the fragility of some regimes. And so even if they know, if you say to them, okay, but this means Hamas survives, and that's bad for you, they'll acknowledge it's bad for us, but they have to deal with the first things first. We'll figure that, we'll worry about that later. And you won't see any of them. I will say this, you have the Crown Prince of Bahrain. There's something known as the Manama dialogue that's going on right now. The Crown Prince of Bahrain made a very tough, bitter denunciation of Hamas, holding them responsible for all this. He really stands alone as a leader in the region for saying this, because no one else is saying it. And I can tell you, Palestinians that I know who have no love for Hamas, they're also very reluctant to get out there and say anything that looks critical of Hamas. And the reason is not just it's this public movement, it's more than that. It's this, somehow they conflate the notion that if they are critical of Hamas, it means they're defending what the Israelis are doing. That's the mindset. And so you're really not seeing anybody other than, as I said, the Crown Prince of Bahrain come out there. But there's another part of the question that's important, and it gets to what I think is a reality. Everything I'm hearing, which is different than before, I've pushed for the last 2 years of our administration and Arabs to reform the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And I have to say, up until now, my pushing got nowhere for a variety of reasons. I see a very different mood right now, a very strong impulse that when this is over, to require Abu Mazen to bring in someone untainted by the Palestinian Authority, to reform and revitalize the PA the way it was done in the past. Salam Fayyad came in 2007, which was the year that the PA Fatah lost Gaza in a coup to Hamas. They lost credibility because of that. There was complete lawlessness in the West Bank at that time. Salam Fayyad was, because of pressure by the Bush administration and the donors, other donors, Abu Mazen appointed Fayyad. He empowered him, and he cleaned things up. For 5 years, he transformed the realities. It was done before. It can actually be done again. Now I'm seeing an impulse to do that, but there's also an impulse to say, whatever is done, whether it's reconstruction, revitalization of the PA, it needs to be part of a larger process that is addressing the fundamental question of the conflict. And so there is a need. Arabs want to hear a political horizon. How does this end? Now, the Biden administration talks about 2 states for 2 peoples. I think that's very important. I'm trying to introduce an additional concept that I think can work for both sides, because I think Israelis right now, given they haven't processed everything yet, psychologically, I think the idea that they would make concessions to Palestinians right now is not something that is even kind of on the psychic horizon. They have to go through, in a sense, the process of coming to grips with what has happened. And one way I think you can deal with both is you can address Arab needs by saying there needs to be an end to occupation, but the end to occupation has to be done in a way that is fully consistent with Israeli security needs. So you address both sides of the equation, and that allows you to say something that takes you beyond 2 states for 2 peoples.
When people talk about the end game, it really should be plural, because you have so many different kinds of considerations. You've got infrastructure, which is essentially humanitarian. You've got political, you've got regional and diplomatic. And just this week, there's new satellite imagery showing that over the last 6 weeks, about half of all the buildings in the northern Gaza Strip have been damaged or destroyed, twice what it was 2 weeks ago. So even if the war were to stop now, all of those considerations would be paramount. So who puts together the list? What is the list of what gets done first, when and if this war part of it, the attack part of it, is over?
I don't see anybody else doing it other than the United States. I think it has to be the Biden administration. I think it has several parts to it. Part one is you're going to need a new administration in Gaza. And that administration has to deal with civil issues, security issues, and the reconstruction issues. If you go back to if you look at past instances of something like this, the Khmer Rouge obviously destroyed completely Cambodia. There was a UN mandate that created the equivalent of a kind of UN-run Cambodia for several years. Actually, a senior Japanese official came and was the person who was in charge of that administration. They had a 15,000 person security force that was brought in. I'm not looking at the equivalent of that, but I'm looking at something that is similar in terms of an international mandate. If the US is the one who makes a suggestion for this kind of a UN mandate, the Russians will veto it. But if it comes from the Arabs, the Russians will not veto it. And so there needs to be, we should come up with an initiative that we work out, coordinate, choreograph with the Saudis and others that would focus on defining what a UN mandate would be, the way a civil administration would look. I prefer to see Palestinian technocrats running that administration. I prefer to see a mix of regional and other forces from outside the region to take care of security. I would like to see the Canadians, who have a lot of experience in post-conflict situations, be responsible for developing the mechanism for managing the materials that come in, making sure they go for the intended purposes. It's a complicated undertaking. It has multiple layers to it. As I said, if you wait until the day after to plan and organize, it'll be too late. You have to move fairly quickly to begin to, you put your finger on, It's not just the buildings, it's the roads, it's the water mains, it's the water pipes. You have to do immediate construction very quickly. I do think you will find the Gulf states will be prepared to fund this in a way they haven't been prepared to fund before. I think the Saudis, the Emiratis, I certainly would hold the Qataris to a standard that I would hold above others. They were providing monies to Hamas throughout. I would like to see them provide monies for rebuilding Gaza in the aftermath of this.
Is all this in the works already? And is the Biden administration already trying to assemble this plan so something is in place when the war part of this ends?
I think they have begun working on it. I know they've begun thinking about it. I mean, I know, because obviously I talked to a lot of them. So I think they are beginning to work on it. There's a lot, you need a concept, but once you have the concept, then you have to begin to start talking to your partners. So we need to be talking to the Europeans. We need to be talking to the Arabs. The Arabs want to see it as part, as I said, of a broader process. The words that have been used with me, a holistic process. I think, again, I understand all of this is complicated, but just because it's complicated doesn't mean you don't have to work through it and do it.
Roseanne has a question whether there could eventually be two Palestinian states, one in Gaza and one on the West Bank, each administered by a different Palestinian entity, neither of them Hamas.
The answer is no. The Arabs won't support that. One of the reasons you've heard President Biden talk about ultimately the PA needs to come back. I underscore the word ultimately. Prime Minister Netanyahu said, can't have a PA that's still, that is not criticizing Hamas, that is engages in dialogue, is corrupt and so forth. The fact is the reason that the Arabs are emphasizing the need for reforming the West Bank is they understand you can't have a two-state outcome if you don't have the political reunification of the West Bank and Gaza. So you can't have two different leaderships in the West Bank and Gaza. You will not get Arab support for reconstruction in Gaza if you don't have a plan that's part of reforming and revitalizing the PA. So in time, the Arabs will be the first to agree. The PA is in no position to come back into Gaza now. Too weak, too discredited, can't manage itself in the West Bank, can't expect it to be able to manage in Gaza. So they're not pushing that. But because they want a political horizon with two states, you have to have in their eyes, you have to have a reunification politically of Gaza and the West Bank.
The word genocide has been used more and more by both sides in this conflict. Over the weekend, Roz Siegel, an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, wrote in the LA Times about the dehumanizing language of the defense minister and suggesting that Israel is engaged in genocide rather than targeting individual Hamas militants. On the other side, just today, the National Security Council's John Kirby pushed back against that idea and the word. He said, Israel isn't trying to wipe the Palestinian people off the map, isn't trying to wipe Gaza off the map. It's trying to defend itself against a genocidal terrorist threat. So if we're going to start using that word, fine, let's use it appropriately. That's an incendiary word, but it's out there starting fires all over the place.
It is, and it would be good if, if the definition of genocide was one that people were reminded of. Genocide is the effort to exterminate a people. What John Kirby said is right. The Israelis are not trying to exterminate the Palestinian people. The fact is, Hamas would like to wipe Israel out. That's it. Once, I've said it before. Hamas is not about ending occupation. If it was about ending occupation, it wouldn't have tried to block with bombings what we did, in the 1990s when we were close. If it was about ending occupation, it might have supported Saudi normalization because there was going to be a Palestinian component to it. Hamas is not about ending occupation, it is about ending Israel. If we're going to use the term genocide, it should reflect what the actual definition of genocide is.
And to that end, do we see in Israel any of the kind of public protest? Obviously, we had protests over the changes in the judiciary before October 7th, but are there public manifestations of unhappiness with Netanyahu and the cabinet, or at this point, is there so much invested in winning this war that all of that's going to be waiting till later?
It is interesting. I said a little bit earlier, I was the one thing I've been surprised by is I expected most of the political criticism to wait. I'm seeing more of it than I anticipated at this point. Some of the demonstrations over the weekend, which were mostly about the hostages, but you saw a lot of signs in these demonstrations that Netanyahu should go. It's not the predominant sentiment. The predominant sentiment is what you were suggesting, that, look, there'll be time to deal with the politics once this military campaign is over. And let's wait until we do that. It's not, the idea that if you were going to have a change now, that would be, I think, fairly disruptive to the military efforts you're trying to make. So I don't see that, but I'm a little surprised it's been a little bit more prominent than I thought it would be at this point.
A harbinger of things to come once the dust settles?
I've said repeatedly, I use the word, there'll be a political reckoning. Anybody who thinks that, it doesn't think that, is kidding themselves. The time of it, I can't be sure of, but there will be a political reckoning. This was just too dark a day for Israel. The colossal strategic failure was too great. The losses too profound. There will be a reckoning, and it's just a matter of time. I don't know exactly how it'll play itself out, but it's coming for sure.
Ambassador, our much mourned co-founder, David Lair, always liked to end on a positive note. Perhaps you can give us a look ahead and even maybe a sense of time frame, as this conflict has gone on for so long already, and what looks like a calendar for this, and what hopes are coming out of it.
Look, it's very complicated to try to outline how long it'll take. If you ask me, the major part of the military operations, I think, probably go on at least another month. Israel's not done in the north, and then they have to turn to the south. The places in the south are not as complex as Gaza City and the Shitta refugee camp, Jabalia refugee camp in the north. Those are very, very dense, very difficult to deal with. Han Yunis is the closest thing to that in the south. It won't be simple. Plus, you have this population that's moved there. Not so simple either to deal with that. But I think you're probably looking at a military campaign that shifts to the south in the relatively near future. It may look different than what you've seen in the north, because the south is somewhat different than we've seen in the north. You're going to get to the point where the Israelis may have achieved most of their military objectives, but they won't want to withdraw from Gaza and leave a vacuum. But the readiness of others to come into Gaza is going to be limited until the Israelis leave. So sorting that out is also going to be problematic. But to leave with at least one hopeful note, I really do see a very different sentiment among the Arabs to play a very different role than they have in the past in terms of reconstruction, revitalizing the Palestinian Authority, and not necessarily walking away from what would be more political normalization with Israel, provided the Palestinian issue is really addressed. There isn't a readiness to ignore the Palestinian issue any longer on the Arab side, including from those in the past that might have not been so keen to pay a lot of attention to it. That's changed, but I think it also means there's more potential eventually for a real resolution.
Ambassador Dennis Ross, we always appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks to all of you for watching. We hope you have a safe and happy Thanksgiving, and look forward to the new programs we have upcoming, as you see right here. Thank you for joining us.